welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to be talking about some math tips for working with precuts. Now, I've talked a lot about precut patterns, specifically fat quarter patterns, and some of the other precuts that are out there, and I will link to those videos in the description, but we're going to talk about some general tricks of the trade that makes it easier to work with precut patterns that you might not be aware of if you've not done a lot of it. So I hope you find this episode helpful. First things first, if you're going to be working with a precut like layer cake, a charm pack, or a jelly roll, and we're specifically going to talk focusing in on those precuts because fat quarters are fairly large. You can do a lot with a fat quarter and it's not that terribly different from working with yardage, but these smaller precuts that are kind of strips and squares already, those ones can be tricky to get the math to all work out. And I think that's why a lot of people kind of avoid writing patterns for these precuts, even though plenty of people are looking for these patterns. There's always requests for more layer cake patterns and things along those lines. So first things first, when you're working with these kinds of smaller precuts, planning is key, right? I can't tell you how many patterns I've ghostwritten where the designer kind of said, hey, I designed this for yardage, but I would love, a layer cake option in the pattern, right? That is incredibly difficult for me as a ghostwriter because the design's already complete. And the easiest way to write a precut pattern for these smaller precuts is to design with those precuts in mind, right? So anytime you're doing this, you will make your life a lot easier as the pattern writer to write the pattern for the precut rather than the other way around. You don't want to design the pattern, then try to make it fit precuts. You want to design the pattern knowing that you're going to want it to be precut friendly the entire time. You can go backwards, right? You can do this the other way around, but it is much, much trickier. And sometimes it just doesn't really work out. Oftentimes when I'm ghostwriting in that situation, I will end up making recommendations to the designer of, hey, I need to tweak this particular part of the design in order to get this to work better, because otherwise it just becomes too difficult to write and also too difficult for the reader to follow, which is not what we want at all. So that's the first tip. If you know you want to make this precut friendly, know that from the beginning, right? Think about what kinds of fabrics you want to use for this quilt before you kind of finalize the design. Before you start writing anything, before you start doing any math and putting pen to paper, figure out what kinds of fabrics you want to be optional for this quilt. The second really important thing is to use whole precut pieces whenever you can. So what you're seeing on the left here is a quilt pattern called Take Me to the Magic by Sterling Quilt Co. And you can see that this could easily be made in precuts, right? You could use a charm pack here and that would be totally fine. But you do have whole pieces and then you have half square triangles there. And so when you're doing that, you always want to design this using whole pieces, right? So each one of those squares, we want to be using a 5-inch square of. We don't want to be cutting those down to 4.5 inches so that we can use the 5-inch squares to make our HSTs using a 2-at-a-time method or something along those lines, right? And we're going to talk about a trick about how to get HSTs without having to oversize these things using the 2-at-a-time method in just a minute. But anytime you're working with precuts, right, you're going to be using a lot of these squares. Generally, charm packs and layer cakes have around 40 pieces in them. And so if the first thing you've got to do is cut a 1/2 inch off all of those dimensions and cut everything down, it kind of defeats the purpose of using a precut, right? Precuts are precuts because you don't have to cut them. And that's a lot of the draw to them. You also get a lot more variety without having to buy yards and yards of fabric. So whenever you're using them, try to optimize the dimensions of the pattern to use that whole piece without having to cut most of your fabrics down first before you could even start the pattern. Now let's talk about how to get around this problem of the 2-at-a-time half square triangles having to be oversized. So in that previous example, right, you were going to use 5-inch squares for all of the whole pieces, and then you had some half square triangles that needed to be, if you're going to use the 2-at-a-time method, oversized. They needed to be 5.5 inches in order to finish at 5 inches so that you can sew them together with the rest of the charm pack pieces, right? So how do you deal with that? Well, one really, really sneaky little trick that I love to use is using the stitch and flip half square triangle method rather than a 2-at-a-time method. So a lot of people don't realize, but when you're doing stitch and flip corners for like flying geese or a square and a square unit, you can use that exact same process to make a half square triangle. You're just gonna basically sew down the middle line instead of on either side of that marked line. Now, you're only going to get one half square triangle at a time. That is a drawback, right? But if it allows you to use all your precuts at size without having to cut everything down first, that's worthwhile. And this is useful both for layer cakes and charm squares, but also jelly rolls, right? If you're working with a jelly roll pattern, a lot of those end up being like big braille quilts, right? Just straight lines everywhere, which is great. I love a straight line quilt myself. But sometimes you want to have some little angle cuts and stitch and flip corners and things like that. And you can totally use this technique because the stitch and flip corner that you're adding is the same width as the final piece. You don't have to cut anything down or make anything oversized. So this is a really good way to still get those angled pieces without having to kind of modify all of your pre-cut sizes first. The last tip I want to give you is making sure that you optimize at least the most common size in your quilt pattern. Usually that's going to be a throw size for the pre-cut pack size, right? So pre-cuts come in certain quantities. If we're talking about jelly rolls, there's 42 2.5 inch strips per pack. If it's layer cakes and charm squares, those are more likely to be 40 10-inch or 5-inch squares per pack. And so if you don't happen to have all of your sizes in terms of, 40 or 42 piece increments, sometimes the math gets weird, right? You need like 1 1/4 packs or 1 1/4 jelly rolls, right? And then what do you do with the rest of those strips? Well, sometimes you can sneak them into the binding. If it's a jelly roll, that's a totally cool way to use it because you can kind of get a scrappy binding there, which is super fun. But what I would suggest is optimizing the most common size in your quilt pattern. Again, usually that's going to be a throw for the number of pieces in whatever pre-cut size that you're using, so that you're using some whole number of them or close to it, right? So you're using most of 3 packs or exactly 3 packs for the throw size. And then for the baby size or, a queen size, a twin size, either side of that, sizes that are not made as frequently, it's okay if those are like, 1 1/4 pack or 3 1/4 pack or something like that, some odd number where you're going to have some left over, because not as many people are making those sizes. But the most common size, you kind of want it perfectly optimized so that you are kind of using a discrete number of packs without too much left over. You can have a couple pieces, but you don't want to have a ton of it left over. So the most common size in any quilt pattern is always going to be a throw size. That's what people tend to make a lot of because they're really good for gifting. And so for that size, you really want to make sure that you're using a whole discrete number of pre-cut packs, right? So if that's 3 layer cakes or charm packs, 3 layer cakes would be a lot for a throw size quilt, or 2 jelly rolls, something along those lines. This also applies to fat quarters, right? Most fat quarter bundles are going to come in a set of 16 or 20. So for a throw size quilt, you really kind of want to optimize for using 16 fat quarters or 20 fat quarters, something along those lines. That works really well. It's seamless, and it almost seems like this quilt pattern was made for these pre-cuts, which is what you want it to feel like. Hence why you kind of want to plan the design around those pre-cuts to begin with. So those are kind of my grand tips for working with pre-cut patterns. If you have not written a pre-cut pattern, I would really encourage you to try it. It can kind of be a little bit of a puzzle for your brain to kind of sort out math-wise, but it pays off a lot. People love pre-cut patterns because they're really easy to follow because you're using kind of these pieces that are already ready to go. And it really helps for like that scrappy finish because you can just grab a charm pack or a layer cake from a single fabric line where all of the fabrics already go together, and you're going to end up with a beautiful quilt no matter what. That's all I've got for today. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe as always, and I will see you next week for another episode of Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!